Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we have a double bill of US Air Force shot down stories today and tomorrow. Joining me now is Norman Holden, author of The Lucky Seven, to talk about a B-24 over Belgium. And you can find the links to buy his book in the description below and his own website. But I'll bring Norm in now. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Good. Well, thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being here. So when it's a new guest, I bring people on from all types of walks of life, amateur historians with websites, multi-published authors, academic historians. How would you classify yourself as in terms of looking at World War II?
I would say that I'm a author first, storyteller. I would not classify myself as a historian by any means. The story that I'm sharing is a family story that I was able to bring to a book over about 20 years of research.
Brilliant stuff. And we of course we're going to be receiving at some point the massive Great Apple series, Masters of the Air. So everyone is kind of still talking about 8th Air Force. And originally, when I conceived this week for October, I thought the series would be out, but it's next year again now. So, but it's something that people are talking about all the time. So
Yeah.
you come on with a PowerPoint. I'll bring it up on screen, folks. We'll kind of do questions as we go along, really. But I will join in with my questions, and please jump in with yours. So over to you, Norm.
Yeah, so thank you. As I mentioned, this story is about a family member. So the gentleman on the cover was my late father-in-law, James Goble. He was in the 8th Air Force, was a co-pilot in a B-24. And he had a very interesting story that I learned over 20 years ago, that I'd gotten little snippets of it along the way, and the more I heard, I became more curious about it. And eventually, one day we were in about a 3-hour car ride together, and I had him alone. I started asking him questions, and he actually opened up and shared more with me in that 3-hour ride than what I found out he had shared with most of his own children.
Wow.
So it after his passing in the about 20 years ago, my mother-in-law passed along to me all of his information from the war. So he had diaries and letters and all kinds of memorabilia that he had collected, and basically she gifted that to me, and that kind of started the journey of putting the story together. So it really starts out, and I'm gonna refer to him as Goble, even though his first name was James, but in the book it's Goble.
Okay.
He was a senior in high school when Pearl Harbor happened. His older brother was already, by the time Goble graduated from high school and made a decision to enter into the services, his older brother was already in the Army. But he really was passionate about flying. And so that was the path that he took. He entered into active duty in September of 42, and then spent the next year going through basic and then crisscrossing all across America to different bases to get different levels of flight training. So it would from anywhere from San Antonio to Missouri to back to San Antonio. They would bounce troops all around the country to get the necessary training.
And this Norm is the absolute peak of the program, isn't it? Because
yes,
the US starts the war with like the UK did, with limited numbers of everything: instructors, aircraft, pilots, etc., etc. But by 42, 43, that earlier setting up of all the programs is starting to reap dividends now. And we talk about it a lot on this channel, that the results of these programs don't necessarily actually kind of reach the combat theaters till a little bit later in the war, but the groundwork is being done, and it's, you know, almost tens of thousands of air crews are passing through various schools, as you say, across the USA at this point, and the same thing in Canada as well. So this is the result of that earlier realization that we've got, everyone's got to crank up the creation of these specialized positions.
Yeah, and you got to think also the 8th Air Force didn't even start till 1942.
Yeah.
And its worst casualty month, I think, was either September or October. I think it was October of 43. So while Goebel's getting trained, the 8th Air Force is absolutely taking a pounding, trying to soften up, the German forces in Europe. So he goes through the process, gets commissioned, absolutely wants to be in a fighter. Like I think most pilots of that age, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to be that fighter ace, and who wouldn't want to fly in something that had a whole lot more horsepower and agility, and probably a lot more fun to fly than a boxcar, which is ultimately what Goble got assigned to, which to his dismay, he got assigned to the heavy bombers, the B-24s. He ultimately ended up in Clovis, New Mexico, as part of the 302nd Bomb Group, where he went through heavy bomber training and was assigned to his crew. And when you think of a B-24, I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to be in one in flight, but these machines were made for a single purpose, and it was utility, and there were no creature comforts in them whatsoever. It was meant to haul ordnances long distances, and it was not fun to fly. And frankly, I remember Goble telling me that a couple times, that it was a bear that you basically had to wrestle with the entire time to fly this machine. And then its true elevation, or top elevation, of 28,000 feet, you're flying in a tin can, or that's at least the thickness of the liner of the skin, and it's negative 35 to negative 40 degrees, Fahrenheit. It's not a very hospitable place to be. And then from personal experience, I could tell you that there's not a lot there wasn't any creature comforts built into them whatsoever. I tried to climb around inside of one actually during flight, and the bomb bay, the catwalk in the bomb bay was less than 9 inches wide. And then to get from the nose to the back compartment, you're on your hands and knees crawling around inside this aircraft. So it was an incredible piece of machinery that did a job, but it definitely was not something that I think most pilots were inspired to want to fly into.
We've talked about on the channel before, there are kind of two types of aircraft: those that the pilots and crews loved immediately, the Spitfire, P-51 Mustang, and there are those, the ones they grew to love, perhaps the B-26 Broad or the B-24, because they were, as you say, a bit of a struggle, bit hard to get the techniques of, and yet growing up where I did, where all the 8th Air Force bases are in the UK, I met as many American 8th Air Force vets who loved their B-24s eventually as those that loved their B-17s. It just was like an awkward relationship at the beginning.
Yeah, well, especially for what these young men went through. I got to imagine that if it brought you home safely, you probably loved it. But learning to fly it was probably not the most enjoyable thing. So one of the first things that happened after he went through this training was, I always thought that, they just get on a transport ship, and they would sail across the Atlantic to whatever theater of operation. And what ended up happening is they were basically assigned an aircraft in Northern Virginia, and they were tasked with flying this in about a 2-week journey around to the European theater of operation. And this was in the middle of the winter time, so at that point in time, this was the preferred route for because it was obviously warmer, and then the shortest legs between South America and Africa, or from Brazil over, is at that point, that's the shortest distance. So they went on this journey where they left out of Virginia, started flying their first plane they got. They're halfway to Florida, and one of the engines blows on them. So they're not even away from homeland yet, and they're already experiencing challenges. So they get to Florida to land at a base, and they are handed a different aircraft and basically told to continue on. And they don't ultimately know what theater of operation they're going to end up in until they actually leave the homeland U.S. And then the captain, Kinzora, had orders that basically told them where they were going at the time. So they continued this journey down to through Trinidad, and then a couple stops in Brazil, and not without peril, because while they were at their last stop in Brazil, one of an aircraft the night before took off in bad weather and ended up circling back and crashing and killing the entire crew. And one of these young men that was on that particular crew was in Gobel's flight training classes. So here's somebody that he already knew that unfortunately was killed in action, trying just to simply transport an aircraft to its final destination. And then as you look, they go across the western tip of Africa into Morocco, and then they have to fly and kind of jog around Spain at the time, because Spain's neutral and they couldn't go over the top of it. And then they deliver their aircraft into I think it was just outside Wales, if I remember, at some point in time, and that's where they're assigned to really to a replacement. And that's what they are at the time, because as you mentioned earlier, this is kind of the height of when things are really rolling. And by April of 44, this is the overture to Overlord, where the 8th Air Force is really trying to soften up German defenses. And so they are assigned to the 445th Bomb Group, 702nd in Tivenham. They arrived there after kind of bouncing across the country from where they delivered the aircraft. And basically when they landed, they thought this aircraft was theirs. They thought that was going to be their plane that they were going to continue to fly in whatever missions going forward. And to their surprise, they landed, took their gear off, and away the plane went and got assigned to somebody else. And they got moved on to Tivenham, where they were eventually put into action. And the day that they're getting assigned to their Quonset hut, there was a crew that day that didn't return from a mission that were MIA. I think there were several that day on April 12th. So here's this brand new replacement crew. They're getting assigned their barracks, or where they're going to stay, their cots, or whatever you want to call it. And they're replacing guys that didn't come back that day. which was, somewhat of got to be a surreal experience that, that's the potential outcome.
Yeah, it's a pretty obvious reminder of the risks they're going to be facing.
Yeah.
And you're right that arguably the peak of the 8th Air Force hemorrhaging crews, hemorrhaging aircraft is in the past now. As you said, they're kind of after big week and things are getting better. But as they're getting better, so the duties of the 8th Air Force, there's more tasks being asked of them, as you say there, because we're building up to Overlord and we're continuing the strategic bombing of Germany. So you're through the worst, but now the pressure is cranking up again because the 8th Air Force are being put under immense pressure to do more than one function. And I can only imagine how awful it would be to arrive at your first assignment, your first base, and kind of see, the ground crew going round and clearing the personal gear out of drawers and foot lockers and things and packing up to go back home. And then you're unpacking your own stuff into that environment. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and there's an interesting twist to this that I'll share in a little bit, but we'll move on to their first mission. So April 24th, after a couple of weeks, and what initially happened was Kinzor, the captain, the way it worked was if you were a replacement, you were put in with another crew and ran a couple missions, bombing missions, as a co-pilot to basically understand what you were going to be going through before you took your own crew. So there was a time where they did some formation training. They went out and swept the channel, did some other things. And then Kinzora did a couple of runs himself on bombing missions. And then eventually they were assigned to mission 315, which was Luftwaffe flying schools in Southeast Germany. And you think about the sheer number of aircraft, if you're throwing up 1,600 aircraft to fly on a bombing mission. When I sat and thought about it, that's a procession of 50, 100 miles or more. It's not like you're sneaking up on anybody when you're coming with 1,600 aircraft. So obviously the Germans are sitting there. They're obviously, you can see them coming and they're waiting for them, and they're throwing up 57-pound rounds that will reach 37,000 feet clear past wherever these B-24s will fly. And then as they're flying in to drop their payload, they're just trying to fly through this flak field of debris and hope that you don't end up being one of those unlucky ships that evaporates with a single hit. And they were successful. They went over, did their dropped their payload and started to return back. And then about 3:30 in the afternoon, they crossed over the German-Belgian border and a Messerschmitt. So they were on the tail end of the procession, and Messerschmitt came up and hit them directly. I would say where all the hydraulics. Obviously, the pilot knew where to hit the aircraft because it did maximum damage without a whole lot of rounds, because it was basically one strafing or scraping across the aircraft and hit the hydraulic lines and caught the aircraft on fire. One of the crew members that was a waist gunner, a gentleman named Earl Klingensmith, he unfortunately caught some rounds, I think, in the shoulder and was wounded. Everybody else managed to get out of the aircraft without being seriously wounded. But at this point, all the training that I talked about a little bit before, they never trained them to jump out of an aircraft. They trained them how to put a parachute on, but they didn't ever train them to, okay, you're at 24,000 feet, your plane's on fire. The natural instinct is obviously get out of it. But at the same time, when there's a fire and there's smoke inside of it and you lose communications, and that's what happened to them. They had no idea what people in the different compartments of the plane were doing because they couldn't communicate with each other. So each kind of group were on their own to take care of themselves and ultimately make the decision to get out of the aircraft. So there were 3 or 4 in the back that went out through a rear hatch. Up in the nose gunner, because the hydraulics went out, was stuck inside the ball turret and couldn't get out, and they had to physically crank it around to get him to where he could climb out of it. And then just escaping from the aircraft, one of the gentlemen, as he came out, unfortunately clipped his head, knocked himself out. So it's by no means is it a graceful departure. And what ends up happening is they're scattered across about 60 kilometers of Belgian countryside, kind of like, seeds dropped in the wind. And they all 10 of them end up with, for the most part, with very different results. There were a few lucky ones that were picked up by the underground. There was, Earl that I mentioned. He unfortunately ended up in POW camp. Several of them ended up in POW camps, but Earl had to spend some time in some hospitals to get mended up before he ended up being shipped off. But that's how you mentioned earlier. There were, thousands. I forget the number in total of airmen. I think it was like 500,000 or more that ended up in POW camps over the course of the war, and there was, I think, like 26,000 casualties from the 8th Air Force, from folks that unfortunately didn't make it back. But for Goble, he landed in a small town, a little hilly town in Belgium, and was fortunate enough to land cleanly in a field, didn't hit any obstacles, and it didn't take very long for the locals to show up to where he was and help him kind of get away. And even for him, you're this 20-year-old kid in the middle of a foreign country, and you got people running at you, and you just have to hope that they're the good guys. And fortunately enough, for Goble, it was the case, and a young farmer kind of took him off into the woods and buried him in some brush and leaves and left him, and came back after dark to get him. And that kind of started a journey over the next several weeks of him trying to escape and evade the Germans.
And just to backpedal a little bit, Norm, because you said this has been effectively kind of a 20-year process. We know, because that's how it worked, that the 8th Air Force had these big box formations. That's how, it was defense by numbers. Everybody had their place in the box, and you have this massive machine guns protecting it there. So inaugural flight mission, in your analysis of this, do you think it was just sheer bad luck that the Messerschmitt picked on that aircraft and it was a completely random thing, or do you think maybe there was something the German pilots were, maybe the aircraft wasn't quite in his formation as neatly, and there was a recognition that it was a green crew? What's your thoughts on that?
That's a great question, because I thought about that quite a bit, and I wasn't able to determine it on my own. And my hypothesis was that I kind of felt like for the crews that flew more, you were probably at the front of the line.
Yeah.
If you were brand new, you were probably at the back of the line, because the back of the line is probably where folks are going to get attacked first, But that's just me taking a guess at it.
Yeah, it's hard. And the other thing, it came up in the sidebar about the fact that they haven't had parachute training. They know how to put parachutes on, and they know roughly the theory, but there's no way they could have put the entire 8th and 9th and 15th Air Forces through parachute training, because putting that number of thousands of people through, and let's say they've all got to do 2 or 3 practice jumps, you're going to lose 2, 3, 4, 5% of those people to broken ankles, broken backs, things like that. And you can't afford to lose these commodities you've spent a year or more training up pilots, co-pilots, navigators, then losing some of them. The option had to be that you knew what to do if you had to bail out, and you there's no on the job training. And it also came about the escape and evasion. We did a show in the past where my guest had the section, I think it was the officers' mess, where they had all sort of maps and things of previous escapers, and over the course of weeks, when you attached yourself to a squadron, you'd gradually read all these information, these pamphlets and language things and tips and things like that. But if you literally just arrive, I know, okay, they've been there, if you haven't had time to go through that, everything's happening so fast for this crew, it's unbelievable.
And there's an interesting thing. So to be an airman that jumps out of an aircraft because it's wounded aircraft and you have to get out of it, you become a member of what's called the Caterpillar Club. And there was a little Caterpillar pin that they would have received eventually, but it was total baptism by fire to go through what they did. So once he's on the ground, there's already a little bit of pre-work that has happened with the underground and Allied forces back over in England, and they obviously had to have ways to verify, because the Germans at that point in time were already putting their own soldiers in Allied uniforms and putting them into the lines to try to break up the resistance lines. So there had to be a way for them to verify identity, and it was a simple 10-question question and answer thing from what do you call your life preserver to some other very specific signals that they had to have. They at least had to know that information going over, because somebody was going to ask them if it ever occurred. And the first gentleman in the top left is Rene. He was one of the first people. He wasn't the first person to interact with Goble. He was actually the first true member of the underground that was assigned to basically verify his identity. And so that the way it would occur is they'd come in, they'd take photos, they'd take information, they would pass it along to verify whether or not they were who they said they were. And you got to remember that most of these people that were in the resistance at the time were either very young, they were the same age or younger than our Allied airmen, or they were older. Because anybody that was working age at the time, if you were working age male in occupied Belgium or France, you were off assigned to working in a factory or doing something for the Germans. You weren't necessarily part of the populace. So here are very young individuals that have already experienced 4 years of living in occupied existence, and they are very well trained in ways of dealing with the reality of what they're doing. And Rene was one of the first ones that kind of helped Goble along. The gentleman next to him, Gene, he unfortunately, he and one other resistance member, after a couple days after actually transporting, and by this time Goble had been gathered up with 2 of his other flight crew members that landed in a similar area. So now there were 3 of them. and they're being moved from home to barn to, game hut to you name it, wherever they could find a place to hide them. They were kind of moved around at night. And Gene had the job to transport them to a nearby town, and they did it in a car, and they're doing it at night. And here's 2 young resistance members in the front seat, and they got 3 airmen in the back seat, and they're supposed to be taking some dirt roads to get to where they need to go in the middle of the night. Well, what do? They come across the German patrol, and instead of turning around going the other way, Gene and the driver decide they're just gonna go for it, and they drive right through this patrol. Luckily, nobody's injured at that point, but unfortunately, after dropping Goble off at the next stop and returning home, later that evening and the next day, the Germans showed up on their doorsteps, and unfortunately, neither one of them survived that interaction.
Wow.
So it's very real consequences for these people on the ground, and I will be the first one to say that for me in writing this book, a lot of times people think it's the military member that's the hero. I think they did a lot of brave things, and there was a lot of heroes among them. But for me, in this book, in this story, the true heroes of this are the resistance members.
Yeah.
Because, they're just, for the most part, ordinary people trying to live in this existence and try to survive, but they also have this innate instinct in them that they need help, the airmen, as they get kind of deposited in their homeland. So that takes over a couple weeks period of time. Goble eventually ends up in Liege, Belgium, and he and 2 of his other crew members are put in the custody of this older couple, Desiree and Maria, and they're the caretakers of the St. Paul Cathedral in Liege. So they have a back part of the cathedral that they live in, and these airmen are living in the cathedral with them. And at the same time, unbeknownst to them, the priests in their part of the facility, they're hiding people as well. So it was all, they tried to keep as much of it to themselves, because you don't want people to know what you're doing. But this couple, literally they were Gobel's parents' age. They became their Belgian parents for 3 weeks while they stayed in this cathedral. And Maria, she couldn't speak any English. And really, both of them, neither one of them really could. And the airmen, one of the 3 spoke a little bit of French. So his name was Robert Tucker. He actually was able to, Maria over time would take him out into town and take him to shops. And when she was doing her errands or whatever, she would actually take him out. Desiree would take the others out very, infrequent or a little bit. What tended to happen was other resistant members would show up to check on them, see if they were doing all right, and they would take them about in town. And at this point in time, they're now in a part of the country that is getting softened up by our own 8th Air Force. So they're hiding in Liege, in less than a kilometer from where they're at. The 8th Air Force is bombing the rail yard. And there's action going on where they're at. And and they're experiencing that themselves, because some of these trips where they went out during the day when they could, they would see, what was happening to the town around them. But this couple, they'd already lived, they lived through the first war, and they already understood what life was like, and they were pretty committed to helping people. And they actually, after Goble left the cathedral, there were some airmen that ended up staying with them until Allied forces actually repatriated them when they showed up, several months later. And then the last gentleman on this page is Franz. He was another secret army member that actually took on the responsibility of bringing the group from Liege to, ultimately was supposed to take them into France, but actually only took them to the border, which is his own pretty interesting story. So on the 17th of May, what had happened at that point is up until this point, for the most part, the Allies were they were making arrangements to get folks back to England. And by mid-May, the underground knew that an invasion was going to happen at some point. They just didn't know when it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And that really kind of interrupted any plans of trying to get guys back over to England. So they made the decision that they were going to take them to France and head south. Well, in this group photo, there's 15 of them. So this is a morning. There's about a dozen Allied airmen gathered here, and then the rest of them are resistance members. And one of the things you could, when I looked at this, I'm like, it's a happy gathering. They're taking a group photo. Well, it's also evidence if somebody got in the wrong hands, So
Yeah.
taking photos like this was probably not the smartest thing to do, but at that point in time, they thought it was a good idea. And what they did was they took an old truck and they converted it into an ambulance, and they piled everybody in the back on wooden benches and then started to head out of town. And over time, Goble, probably another thing that, in hindsight, when you think about it, he sat not each day, but every day. So he kind of wrote a cryptic message to himself of where he'd been, and just a word fragment of kind of where he'd been, what town or whatever, so that he could kind of keep track of where he had made his stops along the way. But again, you think about that, that's a piece of information that if it's in the wrong hands, unfortunately, it could potentially harm a lot of people. And some of them were very cavalier about things. One of the stories that got passed along is one of the resistance members took Jim to the theater one night, and they're sitting in the theater. It's in Belgium or Flemish or whatever language it would have been at the time. He's not Gobel's not understanding what's going on, but he's just sitting there enjoying the opportunity to experience this. Well, while he's sitting there, a German officer comes in and sits down next to him with his date. And at that point in time, Goble still has his military issue watch on, and everything else had been replaced. All his uniform's gone. He's in regular clothing, but he's just sitting there enjoying the show, and he happens to look down and look over and realizes who's sitting next to him and sees what he's exposing. And thankfully, the German officer didn't see it, didn't recognize it, and he was able to get out of there. But they were at some point in times, learning some of this history of what happened, it seemed like they took they took chances that maybe you wouldn't think they would take, but at some point, I think they were all just trying to live their lives at the time.
Yeah, and it's the way. I mean, the thing is, as we've talked about this before, as air crews, they are already come from a job where one tiny mistake can result in disaster.
Yeah.
You know, navigator gets coordinates wrong, and you're in the wrong place. You miss your formation. You know, a tail gunner misses the aircraft chasing you. That's it. You're dead. So they come from an environment where perfection at your job is kind of normal, or attempting for perfection.
Yeah.
And in this environment, when you're being looked after by brave members of the underground, the resistance, you know, everybody's aware that one little slip up, one little casual, you know, you're being transported on a tram or something, and you doze off, and you talk in English and you sleep for a moment, or some of those kind of things, or as you say, the watch there, and you're seconds away from something being discovered. And as you made the very good point, and not just yourself being discovered, but an escape line being broken, and a whole network being destroyed because of one person's, I don't want to use the word mistake, but just a random thing of forgetfulness, error of judgment, or just plain old bad luck.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at this one group photo, somebody's got their daughter in there.
Yeah,
you know, there's a young woman in there. You know, so they obviously everything that I learned, it seemed like they took a lot of pride in pulling one over on the Germans, but they were also somewhat cavalier in doing it sometimes.
Yeah.
But so from that point on, they basically progressed to they got to the French border, and what had happened was the French line had been broken by the Germans.
Yeah.
And they had a choice to make. They basically either could go back to Liege and stay there and wait out the invasion, or there was a group of them that decided we're going to move on. So two of the gentlemen that are in this photo, and I want to go back to an earlier story. Two of the gentlemen that are in this photo, the center two top, they were part of the crew that got shot down on April 12th. That when Goble came in to basically get placed in their barracks and take their cots, they were taking these guys' spots.
Wow.
So just by chance, they had, in the progression of moving along through the different stops, they were put together with these two other airmen. And then there's also a RAF airman that had got shot down in March, like March 30th, 31st of the same year, and he had made his way to Liege from Germany, basically on his own. He ended up in this group, and then just before crossing into France, there was a American fighter pilot that just got done bombing a nearby town. I think it was like around that May 15th date. He ended up in the group. Now, as they progressed from Liege to down to the French border, there was a dozen of them together. And because everything kind of fell apart, 5 of the dozen said, we're going to go back to Liege. So there was some RAF, and there was one American, one other guy from Gobel's crew. They decided we're going to go back with the secret army. We're not going to move forward. And then because the Brinkhurst, the British pilot, had lived for so long on his own and been so successful, he basically encouraged the 6 others to say, screw it, let's keep moving. Let's not stop. So they, at this point, they went on their own. They no longer had the secret army to help them. They just basically crossed the border into France and started walking on foot. And the first day's journey, they ended up getting separated and somewhat lost. And so what they eventually did is they took a deck of cards and they would use them as markers and place them along the way. And so they would go in 3 groups, and the rear group would pick the card up as they went along, and they would use them to kind of mark the trail for themselves as they followed each other. And by this point, they got to where they could go as far as they could on foot. And they ended up, again, another amazing story of a family. We think of the secret army as an army. Well, most times it was a family. And at this point, it was a madam, and I think she had close to 12 people, her own kids, another extended family. They were all living in one farmhouse. And these guys had stopped in the woods to take a break and to rest their feet. And one of the a young boy from the farmhouse spotted them in the woods and came out to them and got them to come to the farmhouse. And that madam of the house basically took them in, took on another 7 individuals to care for a couple of days before they progressed on. But what ultimately happened is they ended up, they did buses. They did a couple times. They were on trains. They're basically moving by themselves without any assistance, out of uniform, on a train with a fake ID. And there's a couple instances where, as you mentioned before, the wrong move is probably going to get you at least arrested and probably killed. And here Gobel's on a train, and they're coming. German guards are coming down, and they're verifying tickets. And he's got to get up and present his ID and his ticket, and hope that he's not going to get picked up. But there were, along the way, there's all these different opportunities for him to get picked up.
And we just had a comment made by one of the viewers. This close to the invasion, it's a gamble. Do you stay hidden and wait out for the liberation, or do you continue on the evacuation run? I mean, earlier in the war, if you get shot down in 41, the Allies aren't coming in the foreseeable future. You might as well try and get somewhere. But by 44, the Operation Torches happened in North Africa. We're in Italy. The war is progressing. There is a possibility of just kind of finding somewhere in a forest somewhere and just hiding out, or staying in Liege. But they would have also realized the danger they're putting any locals in. That family you just mentioned, it's been a recurring theme on this channel of what is resistance. And maybe for that family who saw them in the woods there, that 2 days, those 7 stay with them, maybe that was the only, and I'm not diminishing the importance of it, but that was the only act of resistance they actually demonstrated during 4 years of war. But what an act, what a brave, selfless thing where you're endangering your family for that, but lots of variables in this, and these young, you made the point earlier, these are people barely out of their teens trying to make decisions that it's I can't even imagine the stress they're under 24/7.
And all along the way, you got to think that these families, everything's rationed for them. Their food's rationed. So they only get so much food for their own family. Now you're trying to feed 7 grown men on top of it. Or you're trying to feed whoever go back to the older couple at the cathedral. They had 3 airmen under their watch for 3 weeks, and they took care of them. They were feeding them off of whatever rations, whatever they could borrow from neighbors, friends, the black market, whatever they could get their hands on. That's how they were taking care of these guys. So they're all making pretty significant sacrifices.
Yeah.
Never mind if you get caught. That's just, that's even beyond approach.
Yeah, no, definitely.
But eventually what happens is Goble on June 1st, early morning of June 1st, The 7 of them, after getting lost in a thunderstorm in the woods, were able to walk into Fay, Switzerland, and were picked up by the Swiss Army. So at that point in time, you know, Switzerland's obviously neutral, but they are, you're treated very differently. So any individual that comes into the country, they're going to be basically treated like a prisoner, and that's what occurred with Goble and his crew. Is that from the outset they were, you know, put into a prison, interrogated many times, trying to figure out who they were. Once it was determined that they were Allied airmen and that they had walked in, because that was a big difference. Because if a lot of times, if you flew an injured aircraft and landed in Switzerland, you automatically became a POW.
Yeah.
Because you walked in, you were considered what was an invadee. So you were put into a similar camp from the beginning. You were put into an internment camp for about 20 days while you were quarantined. And eventually you were moved to you weren't put into a POW camp. And what they really were put into at the time was whatever the U.S. Embassy and other folks could find for them was, you know, they were in resort towns or wherever they could find a hotel or someplace that they could put airmen up, and that's where they spent the bulk of the time until they could get repatriated.
Yeah, and where exactly? How did Jim cross the border? I mean, did they find a remote bit in the forest and cross there, or did they kind of brass it out through an actual checkpoint?
No, they basically along the way, on their way south into France, they were given a little bit of guidance of when you get to this town, go to this pub. Right. Find this individual, they'll tell you where to go, kind of give you the directions of where to walk in. And when they got down into the last town in France, they were for one night boarded at a farmhouse, and the next evening they were told basically at a certain hour, leave the farmhouse, walk this direction, go out into the woods. And then at the border, there was basically a clearing. You know, there's a clearing and a fence. Well, they walk into the woods and there's a thunderstorm. It's dark. They end up walking in circles for an hour or two until they finally walk out into the opening and see where they need to go by luck. And then they walk into the nearby town. And as soon as they walk into town, they're surrounded and rounded up. You know, treated very much like you would expect at that point. But all along the way after that, there's several rounds of verification of identity. And probably one thing that, you know, I should have mentioned at the very beginning of this is on the day that they got shot down, they're considered MIA. Because there was no record of where they were and they didn't return home. That's what gets communicated to his parents back in New York. Is a telegram arrives a couple weeks later. I think it was on Mother's Day or close to it. Of, hey, your son's MIA, and we don't have any information. And the parents don't hear anything until actually he's been in Switzerland for a week or two before his identity is verified, and then they're finally able to send message back that he's actually in Switzerland. And you think of the sheer, there's a couple books on it, but the reality of it is probably less than 1,000 airmen that physically walked into Switzerland. It's a very small number of people that made this journey and ended up in Switzerland this way. Most of them that ended up there were in aircraft that were bombing Italy and got wounded and had a wounded aircraft and needed to land, and they were put into POW camps. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of history that the Swiss, even though they were neutral, their POW camps weren't the best. unfortunately, some of them were run by people that were sympathetic to the Germans. But this is, I tried to go through and identify, these are all members of the secret army of the resistance, all the way through from Belgium to France. And these are the ones that were communicated to me. And I'll get into that in a little bit here in a moment of how I was able to learn all this information. But it's a pretty impressive group of individuals that as I mentioned earlier, a lot of them are family members that just sacrificed and took a chance. So towards the end, he ended up spending 100 days, a little bit more than 100 days in Switzerland from June 2nd through mid-September. And at this point in time, repatriation, the only way it could occur is Allied forces had to physically be in that part of France. So I think it was, I'll probably say it wrong, but the 7th Army had made their way up through Italy and were finally into France, I believe, at that time. And that's when they were finally able to leave Switzerland, join up with Allied forces, and then were put on aircraft and flown back to London at this point. So basically, Goble was April 24, 44 to September 13th of 44, was MIA or internment, or an internment. Now, you look at the photo, he was, I think, very fortunate to be put in a spot that was on a beautiful resort town in Switzerland. And the Allied forces, there was 100 or so of them that were in this hotel. They were granted pretty comfortable living while they were there. So it was not a hard luck deal by any means, but you got to think that if you walked your way into freedom, you probably earned it at some point. And this is the town that he spent the rest of the war in, and then eventually ended up back in England. Went through more kind of debriefings, interrogations, and at this point, it's the need for the 8th Air Force and the heavy bombers have waned quite a bit, and there's no longer a need to put him back into circulation. And what ultimately ended up happening was he got sent back to the States to become a flight instructor. And that's how he ended up finishing out the rest of his time in the war. So this is the Lucky 7 all together. So the 3 together, and the Gobel's in the middle, and then 2 of his crew members. Yep. Then the 2 gentlemen that I mentioned that were part of the April 12th mission that got shot down, and then Don Brinkhurst at the bottom, RAF, and then Jack Holden. And Jack Holden is, I had the privilege of speaking to him many years ago about his experience, and he shared some of this with me. So I ended up with most of my information through a couple ways. I got information from what Goble had kept of his own. Also, at that point in time, through AFES, the Allied, 5-10 years after the war, more so towards the late 80s and 90s, it was more prevalent where they would go back and forth. The old members of the 8th Air Force would go back to Europe, or the resistance members would come over to the US and they'd have reunions. But through AFES, the Goble family was contacted by people in Belgium. Actually, one gentleman that's a historian over there that reached out and wanted to write a book, and he was very valuable in providing information and was able to fill in a lot of the gaps that I had in trying to put this together. And then additionally, there was they corresponded. There was a lot of letters. I have a pile of letters that are written in French, and that I've had to, get translated and figure out, connect the pieces, because they all have bits of the story that they shared. But as I mentioned earlier on, it was took me 20 years to put this together, and at the end of the day, you hope that you're doing the best job you can to honor those that served, and then also honor those that sacrificed, all those resistance members. So AFI's Jim Goble was a member, and then he ultimately at one point in time became the president of the organization as well. So he's a very active member.
Wow.
And they still have reunions. They have one coming up next month. It's actually a combination with, because obviously the numbers of the remaining veterans that are still with us, it's a much smaller group. So it's the 8th Air Force, and AFIS does a combined reunion now. That's going to happen next month.
Okay.
So just wrapping up, and also in trying to, educate myself in this entire thing. My wife and I made one trip over to Belgium and France to try to follow part of her father's journey at that point in time. In 2014, when we were over there, we actually participated in Father's Day Mass in the same cathedral.
Wow. Was that Father's Day Mass coincidental, or had you planned it around that?
It was totally coincidental.
Because that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And then we had the opportunity in 2019. I think it's the last flying B-24, at least on this side of the pond. We were able to go for a flight in that, and I would say that was for me, that was the final catalyst to finally put a bow on this and get it done and get it published. So, which leads me to this. So,
yeah, well, we have no problems with you doing a shameless plug, because 20 years of work deserves a few of my loyal viewers going out and buying it and checking your website out. Well, masterfully presented, Norm. I have a couple of questions, and there's a couple from the viewers as well. So one of the ones from the viewers is, when you talked about you making the pilgrimage there in 2014, but someone says, did the 7 ever go back to Europe after the war and meet their helpers, or were the helpers ever repaid?
So they did meet. The helpers did. Some of them met each other. There were the ones in Liege. There were 2 or 3 of them that actually came over to the U.S. as part of an AFIS reunion. So they were able to connect at that point in time. And I will say that Jim, and I just received it from Belgium here about a month or so ago. One of the Rene, the first gentleman that kind of vetted him, they kept in constant contact every year. And I received a package about a month ago of Christmas cards and letters that they exchanged for many years. So there was definitely, they were very purposeful in staying connected, for sure.
No, thank you. And Peter is making a point. What kinds of honors, financial rewards did the Resistance Escape Network personnel receive? Any? And I'll kind of add my 2 pennyworth and ask you in a second, Norm. But I mean, generally not enough, Peter. The problem is a lot of these escape lines and resistance networks, a lot of people working with code names, not their real names. It was you didn't know everyone else in the line. So and the Germans broke a lot of these lines. A lot of the people in them didn't survive the war. So for every resistant in Belgium and France who was honored and given some kind of decoration or recognition, there are probably more that didn't. Would you concur, Norm?
I would. And reading the madam in France with the big family, she wrote Jim You know, it was within a few months of the war, asking for help. You know, so you know, to your point, there were some that they didn't know, because there was one gentleman that helped them, give them directions into Switzerland, and he said, "Give me your information so I can reach out to you." Well, at that point in time, to your point, they were still very guarded. They wouldn't give their true information. But they ended up connecting later on, and there was a letter that basically said, "Hey, I'm, you know, the so and so that helped you on this day," and that's how they reconnected with each other.
Brilliant. And Ian is just asking, how did they get back to England, back over the Swiss border into liberated southern France? Or yep, that you're nodding.
So. Yeah. So what occurred is they got onto C-47s in a town in France. Basically, landed in a grass field, loaded up airmen, and it took them 2 weeks, because they had to go around Spain. So they ended up flying down through Morocco and back up around to the UK. Okay. And then while they're in London, that's when I think it was mention of, that's when the Germans were sending all the V rockets over at the time. So now they're back to where they're still being kind of pursued in some ways.
Okay, so and my last question, and you can plead the fifth and not answer it at all, because it might be delving into sort of personal about your father-in-law, but how did he go about adjusting to civilian life after war? Because I mean, he's an absolute ripe candidate for PTSD and all sorts of survivor's guilt. I mean, didn't even complete his inaugural mission. There's the reality of seeing what the 8th Air Force are doing, and you mentioned about the fact he would have seen rail yards blown to hell. He'd have seen what was happening to, or been aware of what was happening to French and Belgians who were helping airmen like him and himself and his friends. And he'd have also seen some of the witnessing to some of the brutality of the German occupation, because it's come up on this channel before. Most people flying over Europe, the war, they were separated from the ground war by tens of thousands of feet. Of course, they were fully aware of flak and enemy fighters, but they didn't really see that boots on the ground of jackboots across Europe. So how did Jim cope with all this? Was it a problem?
No, there wasn't. And I would just say, and not to generalize, I think that entire generation, they came back from the war and they went forth and lived their lives, and most of them didn't talk about it again. And Jim ended up being a very successful airline pilot. He ended up flying for Eastern Airlines until he was required to retire at 60. So he had a career after the military in aviation, and was very involved in the aviation community his entire life. There's actually and a few of his, I didn't mention this, so Jim ended up having 7 children, so 6 boys and then my wife, Jean, and there were several of them that were in aviation as well that they've carried forward. And there is a airfield in Texas that's named after Jim. So aviation stayed in the family. What caused me to write this from the beginning, as I mentioned up front, was, I learned more in a 3-hour car ride than his own kids had heard. And I'm thinking about, at that time, I'm thinking about them, and I'm thinking about my own children, going, how do you capture this and then pass it along? Because it's one of those things that we can't, what you do on a daily basis is bring back history and remind us of what millions of people went through. And
absolutely,
we shouldn't forget it. So.
And it's a story about an Air Force survivor, but it's, as you said, it's as much a story about these brave civilians who some of whom will remain anonymous because of just the the nature of, we talked about, of how these lines operated, and it raises these questions of how any Belgian civilian would react to seeing someone who needs help. You know, you're having to, your part of your brain is telling you I shouldn't get involved because I'm endangering my family. Then there's this humanitarian aspect of it, saying there's a human being who needs my help, and it's, I think most of us are listening to this thinking, what would I do in that situation? Would I just turn away from it, or would I go and help? It's a message, it's a timeless message for everybody, really, of when to get involved, when to step in and be a caring human being.
Yeah, I mean, there was I didn't cover it. There was one family, entire family, mom, dad, couple kids, and elders that were living in a flat above a cafe that the Germans spent time in. And they were snuck in the back door and brought upstairs, and they stayed up there for a couple nights. And right underneath them's the enemy. I mean, some of the things that these people did was just amazing to me. That to your point, I mean, you're an adult making a decision, but you're making that decision. You have your entire family around you, including your kids. To me, that's pretty amazing human being to risk all that.
Yeah, and the suddenness of it is that, you know, in that my family members who served in World War II, it was a gradual process. You know, they got their notification they were eligible for being called up, then they were called up, or they volunteered, then they went for a process of training and getting used to the military and being taught their jobs, and then eventually you find yourself in whatever role you're meant to be. But for these civilians, they could literally be just going about their mind in their own business, you know, putting washing out on the line in their farm in Belgium, and someone walks past who stands out like a sore thumb, because it came in the sidebar. You know, I know you explained the playing card system, but even one or two young men walking through villages, you know, they would have stood out. Okay, the Liege area was sort of a reasonable sized city with people traveling through it. It's a crossroads town, so there would be workers moving through, but they're going to be going down routes. We all know the kind of places that foreigners, quote unquote, are noticed immediately. And you as a civilian have got to make that decision. Just either ignore that person and let them walk past into potential danger, or kind of go out, cross your threshold, go out and say, and motion towards them and say, come in, and again, share your limited food with that. It's incredible instinctive bravery.
Unfortunately, and then there was a third category. There was people that were sympathetic to the German cause, that would not only give up the Allied airmen, they would turn over their neighbors.
True. There were always the bad apples, the rotten apples in all these countries who are seeing it from the other point of view. It says opportunists to make money and gain influence. But well, Norm, it's been fantastic talking to you. I'm glad I reached out to you. Good.
Thank you.
The link to your website is in the description below. I hope a number of my viewers go out and buy it, and good luck with this. And it's been a fantastic pleasure listening to you. Did you enjoy sharing the story with my audience?
I did. I truly appreciate it, and thank you for doing this.
No, thank you. So, folks, I'll be back again tomorrow, same time. In the meantime, thank everybody for watching. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.